Welcome, everyone, to the Association for Social Economics podcast series. Throughout the series, we will explore the profound and multifaceted impacts of economics. This podcast series is sponsored by the ASE, whose mission is to foster research and publication centered on the reciprocal relationship between economics and the broader questions of human dignity, ethical values, and social philosophy. Each month, I get a chance to sit down and interview scholars in the field. I'm your host, Iris Buder, and with me today, I have Dr. Luis Monroy-Gómez-Franco. Dr. Monroy-Gómez-Franco is currently an assistant professor in the Department of Economics of the University of Massachusetts Amherst and external associate researcher at the Centro de Estudios Espinosa Iglesias. Dr. Monroy-Gómez-Franco holds a PhD in economics from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. His research interests are at the intersection of development, labor, and stratification economics, focusing mainly on social mobility and inequality of income and opportunities. Dr. Monroy-Gómez-Franco deeply believes that the economy does not operate in a vacuum, which implies that it is necessary to incorporate historical and institutional factors into the analytical framework with which we study the dynamics of distribution and production observed in the economy. This cuts through both analyses at the macro and micro levels as institutions shape the opportunity spaces and constraints in which individuals operate. So thank you so much, Luis, for being here with us today.
Thank you, Iris, for the invitation. I'm very happy to be in this podcast.
Awesome. So can you tell us a little more about yourself, your background, and what motivated you to get into the field of economics?
Well, that's a very good question, and it got me into a very deep state of reflection about my own trajectory up till now. I did my BA in economics in Mexico at the School of Economics of the National Autonomous University of Mexico, which is a very pluralistic institution in terms of how economics is taught there. You get like the mainstream curricula, but you also have a very, very important core in Marxist political economy. And also another branch is dedicated to structuralist and post-Keynesian economic theory. So that provides you with a good glance of what is the different approaches to studying economic, and particularly from the lens of production, distribution, and not only exchange, as it's sometimes the case when you are only focused on the mainstream approach, let's say. So the reason I ended up studying there is because when I was in high school, I had a class on Latin American history, and it was focused in particular on the period between the 40s and the 70s, which, and with a strong focus on the political and the social developments in the region. And one of the key things to understand of Latin America during that period is the import substitution industrialization project. So I was very curious to learn, well, what's that and who thought about that? So that led me to read, the focus on Latin America led me to read both Raúl Prebisch, who's the founder of the Economic Commission for Latin America and now the Caribbean of the UN, and who basically is one of the founding fathers of Latin American structuralism, which can be understood as one of the main schools of thought in the continent, at least up until the 80s. And the other thing that I read during that class was a bit of Marxist historic materialism. So that led me okay, so if I want to understand what's happening in the world, and that was during 2008, I need to understand the economy. So that threw me directly into studying economics in the BA. And the difference between how economics is taught in Mexico compared, for example, with the US, is that once you pick your degree or your major in Mexico, that's 5 years of you only studying that. So you get like very specialized from the very beginning. And I end up liking very much what I saw in this pluralistic approach. I particularly was attracted to the focus of structuralist economy, which puts not only the economic concerns at the front, but also the historical and institutional background of how the economy develops in particular ways, and why you see certain productive structures arising in particular societies, And in particular, the notion that, well, how you can have very different distributional arrangements across the world. After graduating the university, I did a master's also in economics, like to get a better handling on econometrics, particularly. Like I did my master's in an institution that is el Colegio de Mexico, which is very focused on applied stuff. So then by the end of my master's, I started during my BA dissertation was on monetary policy. During my master's, I started doing some applied work on intergenerational mobility and inequalities. And that was like the moment that I decided like to switch gears from focusing on like the macro and more like traditional policy realm type of discussion to a more, okay, I want to understand what determines how income is distributed, but not only in one period of time, but what is the determinants, the deep determinants of income and basically the differences in life trajectories that we observe in modern day societies, with a strong concern about understanding how inequality can be so persistent in Latin America. So if you read the economic history of the continent, one main thing that always is highlighted is that at least since the 19th century, economic inequality has been very high and persistently, and you see a lot of institutional persistence in terms of how certain arrangements in terms of distribution survive even social revolutions. So I wanted to understand that. Mm-hmm. And that led me to do my PhD at CUNY, which has a very strong focus, the GC, in studying inequalities, and particularly in studying intergenerational inequalities.
All right. Well, thank you. That is a fascinating background to me. So interesting. And so for those who may be unaware, can you explain what stratification economics is and the importance of this field?
Yeah, so stratification economics is a subfield in economics that it's focused on studying the distribution of economic resources and consequently the distribution of power in societies, putting special attention to the institutional determinants behind that distribution. So just as a reference, traditionally in economics, we tend to explain, or the mainstream explanation of inequalities is based on differences in access to education, to health, and differences in the prices that certain types of education has in the labor market. Institutional stratification economics focuses not only on those, but it looks far beyond them. So like, well, what determines that certain occupations rank systematically higher, or that why certain groups have more access to the socially valuable credentials instead of others? So you might say that the main concern in stratification economics is, well, what determines the social hierarchies? What institutions determine those social hierarchies that end up producing these differences that the mainstream approach posits as the main determinants of inequality? So in that sense, I would say that the focus of stratification economics is on the deep determinants of inequalities in societies, and in particular in how those deep determinants are shaped by the historical development of different societies. So it forces us to understand the history of the society that we are studying in order to understand how very different institutions might lead to the same distributional outcome, or how the same institutions lead to very different distributional outcomes. And the importance is that if we want to tackle particularly persistent inequalities, I think that it is crucial to go more than just saying, well, we need to provide more education to everyone. Well, we need to understand why that might not work, and why it might be the case that certain particular groups have been excluded from accessing the credentials that are socially valuable, or have been sidelined from the benefits of economic growth. So if we want to really engage in transforming societies into more equal societies in terms of the distribution of opportunities, we need to take the focus on the institutional and historical determinants, and that means we need to take a stratification economic lens to public policy.
Yes, absolutely. And so you've touched upon this a little bit already, but could you provide maybe some specific examples of how stratification economics manifests in real world economic phenomena?
So I want to, or something that I like to do during the class that I teach on stratification economics is I like to give examples at the macro level, but also at the micro level, right? So since it's an undergraduate class, I think that that's a good way to give context to the students, not only of what's happening in the world as a whole, but also in their immediacy. And I'm going to use two examples. One is, let's think about how negotiations occur between a person that is seeking to hire a contractor, like to fix the ceiling of their house, and what determines all the elections that the person makes, all the choices that the person makes in that process. So the person first has to look, well, what is the supply of possible contractors in the particular region? So that means, okay, what are the opportunities for people that engage in those types of activities, and what are the outside options for those people, right? So that means that you need to gain, I mean, these are not calculations that a person does, but it's the underlying to that particular interaction in the market. So that means that if you want to understand how easy to find a contractor, you need to understand the dynamics of the local labor market. And those dynamics are shaped by who has access to education. And that means that you need to understand the institutional determinants of the access to education, and also how many competitors the person might have. Because that means that when you engage in a transaction with that person, you are going to be in a very different position in terms of bargaining power. If you are the only client and there is a lot of contractors because there was an economic downturn at the aggregate, then that may be putting more power in your hands in terms of how you can negotiate and extract resources in terms of the negotiation power. But also it might be the case that you live in a region of the country where there is a very defined hierarchical order in terms of, well, who actually performs those type of service activities and who is the person who demands those service activities. And there might be a series of informal practices on how you conduct around them, right? So if you compare, for example, the contractor market here in the US with some Latin American countries, you will find out that in Latin American countries, it is more frequent to expect a certain let's say, difference from the contractor to the person who is hiring them, in terms because there is this recognition of the asymmetry in the hierarchy, in the social hierarchy, whereas in the US, that's not frequently the case. So once you start like unpacking this very small interaction, like you need to hire someone to fix the ceiling, you start to realize all the inequalities that are actually underlying that very simple interaction. And I think that providing an stratification economics lens allows us to understand, well, the market is not necessarily this faceless mechanism that just puts people together and operate transactions, but turns out there are a lot of things that might be happening and that might affect the outcomes of the market process. And the other example that I want to give is when we think about, for example, how we regulate the labor market. The labor market is perhaps a market in which almost everyone has an experience in it, because almost everyone earns their income from their labor. So that means that if you regulate the labor market as if it was just another market, you are not going to be conscious of all the spheres in life that the labor market touches upon. So one thing that surprised me when I arrived to the US is that there is no mandated paid leave in the United States, paid parental leave. Whereas in a developing country such as Mexico, that's something that has existed for a long time. And you start seeing like how that is shaping actually the operation in terms of who's expected to provide care, who's expected to make more sacrifices, who's expected to exit the market for longer periods of time than others, And that means that that's providing you with a clear glance of, well, what is the social hierarchy that is underlying the organization of the labor market? Like who's playing the support role in that market in terms of guaranteeing that it's capable of operating without a hitch when people have kids. So I think that taking an stratification economics lens also allows us to understand these social hierarchies that affect the policy design.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, that is something that I personally also like to research as well. So it's just fascinating to hear how you approach it, especially in your classes as well, and how you quote unquote make sense of it in that way. So I think that's a great approach. So then moving on to a little bit of a more global analysis. So how does globalization impact economic stratification, and what are the implications for both developed and developing countries?
So I think that when we take a stratification economics lens to the international scope, we start to see like the clear areas of contact between stratification economics and other schools of economic thought, particularly from the South. Like, as I said, I was more familiar with Latin American structuralism, which has its roots in classical political economy. But one topic that is key to understanding Latin American structuralism is, well, how Latin American economies in particular insert themselves in the global economy, and how that insertion has changed throughout the history of the continent, and how that insertion has affected the hierarchical ordering inside those countries. So I think that taking a stratification economics lens is taking that approach from Latin American structuralism, but getting it into a more wider scope to understand not only, for example, the internalization of the service markets. Like, why is the case that some type of migrants are dedicated to, for example, performing care work in developed societies, whereas, and you see the type of dynamic replicated inside developing countries, but with internal migration, for example. I think that that's a neat way of saying, well, how are we constructing hierarchies both at the national and at the supranational level, that migration is helping to fulfill those tasks or those activities that are socially deemed to be, although necessary, not to be rewarded as highly as other activities in society. Similarly, I think that it helps us to understand why there are differences in power in terms of how countries negotiate their interactions. Like this idea of the war market being a globalized market, very similar to the market that we see inside a nation, clearly oversights the fact that all international trade is regulated, in the sense that there are laws that regulate how and when you should trade with different partners, and if there is a tax or not. So that means that understanding the bargaining position from which each country engages in those interactions allows us to understand, well, how is that going to affect inside both the hierarchies inside those countries, but also who ends up benefiting from which type of agreements. So in that sense, I think that taking that area of contact between stratification economics and the focus on the hierarchic ordering of societies is very in line with the lessons that we can also understand from Latin American structuralism with regards to the external insertion of the economy and how that impacts the internal structure.
Amazing. So turning our attention to your research, which is vast, very in depth. I've been looking at it myself. So we're only going to highlight a few areas, but before we get to do a deeper dive into some of your specific pieces and articles, can you describe your research agenda and really your area of study, and then what motivates you to be involved in this area?
So I think that my research has, as the underlying current in all the work, is to understand how, or let me rephrase it. to understand how are opportunities in terms of the capabilities of a person being able to decide what to be and who to be are shaped, how the distribution of those of the opportunity to making those choices occurs in different societies, with a special attention to Latin American societies and particularly Mexico. So from that point of view, I will say that most of my research is interested in finding, well, if those determinants are persistent through time, so if they are shaping intergenerational mobility patterns, like for those who are not necessarily fluent on what that is, that means that how likely is that you remain in the same position in the economic distribution as your parents, or if you are able to climb or move downwards in that distribution, and also how that determines and affects the incidence of the macroeconomic cycle, and how that distribution of opportunities also affects the capacity of a person or a household to adapt to a global shock, for example. So I would say that that's a good way to summarize my research.
Yes. And so you have a new article published in the Quarterly Review of Economics and Finance titled Shades of Social Mobility, Colorism, Ethnic Origin, and Intergenerational Social Mobility. And for our listeners, we're going to link all our articles that we mentioned here in the show notes. So could you elaborate on some of the key findings or insights from this research article?
So I have to say that the origin of that paper was the reluctance by some Mexican social researchers and also some American economists to believe that, well, Mexico is a racist country. So there is this notion that the main cleavage of inequality in terms of stratification processes in Mexico is between the indigenous population and the non-indigenous population. With the idea that, well, the indigenous population roughly represents 10% of the total population, and we all know that they have a substantially higher incidence of poverty and extreme poverty, lower educational attainment, and in general terms, they live in more precarious conditions. So the first time we started investigating if there were differences in social mobility by the skin tone of the person, not the ethnic origin, but the skin tone, we found out that, well, turns out Mexico, it's a country where a lighter skin tone actually grants you a higher opportunity of having more education, having higher wages, more job opportunities, and as a consequence, a better social mobility trajectory. So one of the most common comments was that, well, but this effect that you're finding that the people with a dark skin tone is suffering from some sort of discrimination, it's actually because you're conflating dark skin with ethnic origin. So these are the indigenous people. What I do in that article is show that that's not the case. Actually, if you disaggregate between the indigenous population and the non-indigenous population, you find that regardless of your ethnic origin, if you have a lighter skin tone, you're going to do better in life than your peers in terms of ethnic origin. There is a gap between indigenous and non-indigenous. Like, to put it on perspective, the probability of remaining at the bottom of the economic distribution if you are a non-indigenous person is of roughly 35%, and if you have a light skin tone, and the equivalent probability for an indigenous person with a light skin tone is roughly 12 percentage points higher, sorry. So that means that you are more likely to persist at the bottom if you are an indigenous person with a lighter skin tone than if you are a non-indigenous. But if you look between the indigenous, those with a darker skin tone have an even higher probability of persisting at the bottom, which is roughly 15 percentage points. So it's above 50% of remaining there at the bottom, which is, I think, clear evidence that, well, Mexico not only discriminates by ethnic origin, but it's also discriminating by skin tones. So that's the focus of that paper, that there are different axes, as I like to call them, of stratification in society. And in the Mexican case, you cannot preclude, like, you cannot fault ethnic origin with skin tone. They are different, and they produce inequalities that need to be taken into account when designing public policy.
That's such a novel approach to research, so very fascinating work. Additionally, you have a paper that's titled The Potential Effects of the COVID-19 Pandemic on Learning, which was published in the International Journal of Educational Development. And in that paper, you examined the implications of the pandemic on educational outcomes. So how do you believe the pandemic has exacerbated the existing inequalities in access to education, particularly marginalized communities?
So I think that's a great question, and that's a question that we should be all making to our governments and to policymakers in terms of what they're doing. And why is that? Well, that paper arises from the fact that Mexico had no evidence, or let me rephrase that, no empirical evaluation of the effects of the pandemic. So we had to rely on modeling strategies, like theoretical modeling, and derive what is going to be the impact. And something that dawned upon us when we were working on that, that's a joint project with Roberto Vélez and with Felipe López Calva, is that the problem is that we need to understand that the pandemic is not going to affect only when class were suspended, but because learning is a cumulative process, that means that any gap that is not covered today is going to affect future learning. So that's going to have a cumulative effect through time if we do not take actions now. And what we see is that, well, the fact that there are so large inequalities in current societies means that the kids that were affected by the in-person class suspensions, but that had enough resources, mainly those who are at the top of the income distribution, probably are going to be capable of filling those gaps that appear at that time, either through private tutoring or other academic resources that their parents might be willing and having the opportunity, because they have enough resources, to invest on. But people from more precarious conditions, even if the parents want, they don't have sufficient resources to close those gaps. So the long-run implication of that is that you are going to have not only an inequality that it's arising due to the pandemic, but that it becomes persistent through time, and that it's going to affect the living of the person, of the kids, when they arrive into the labor market, and into which occupations they can insert themselves, how well rewarded are those occupations. And in general, it's going to affect their life trajectories. So the goal there is that we need to pay attention not only to the immediate effects, but also to how those are going to compound, and take action now before that compounding effect is completely crystallized.
Absolutely. And I think you raise a really interesting or important point, not just interesting, but important point of tying this in with public policy, right? Implications and things like that, and making meaningful change. So absolutely agree with that. So reflecting on your work on market reforms in Mexico in particular, what lessons can be drawn for other countries grappling with similar challenges of economic inequality and structural reform?
So I think that one key lesson of the processes of market, the three waves we can say that Mexico has gone through in terms of market reforms, is that you cannot think of the distributional effects of those reforms as an afterthought, which is what happened in Mexico. Like the opening of the economy in the 80s and the decision to make that a persistent pattern in the Mexican trajectory with the signature of the signing of NAFTA really came without any concern of what was the possible distributional impact of the radical changes that will entail for the agrarian sector in Mexico, but also to the service sector that is not being, and in particular the southern regions of the country, that is not being able to catch up or to cling to the positive effects that the trade integration might have. And that led basically to the widening of regional inequalities in Mexico, whereas the north of the country hitched the wagon to the performance of the American economy, the south didn't. And that's why you see that currently the south is actually, in terms of the GDP per capita, more poor than in the 80s. So it has it's a, I mean, I don't like to say it in these terms, but it's a case of degrowth without what you might think of that. So, and the reason why that was not considered was because the mainstream economic theory says that, well, that's not the main concern that you should have in terms of opening markets and making them more efficient. And the other lesson, I think, is that usually those reforms are taken without creating the social legitimacy for those reforms. And in particular, they are thought as being like, well, this is the most efficient thing to do because that's what the textbook says. And thus is a very technocratic, top to bottom view of how to conduct reform. And that process, that lack of democracy in the process of performing macro reforms, might end up not only producing suboptimal results in terms of not taking into consideration the concerns of the people who are not being represented at the top, which if we have a very unequal society that it's persistently unequal, we know that that's going to be the people who has been always at the top. And I will argue that that's what happened in Mexico, but also that some positive things that have taken place, like the reforms to create commissions for antitrust regulations and all of that, lack sufficient democratic currency. Like the population doesn't know why they do and why they are important to have, that if someone proposes to eliminate them, no one's going to defend them. So it's a self-defeating way of conducting reforms. And I think that as more time passes, the Mexican lessons are you cannot disregard the distributional impacts and how that might end up overwhelming any positive thing that you expected the reform to produce. And the positive things, if they lack social legitimacy, might be overturned faster than you might think.
So looking ahead, what are some areas of research that you believe warrant further exploration in the field of stratification economics, especially concerning Mexico's socioeconomic landscape?
So that's a great question. I think that in the particular case of Mexico and Latin America more in general, we are a couple of steps behind of what is the current research in stratification economics for the US. Like you have a very clear documentation of the magnitude of the inequalities by different ascriptional characteristics such as gender, class, race in the US. Like you can also start to dig into how those intersect, how those interact and produce differences in power. In the Latin American case and in Mexico, we are only arriving to that point. So for example, we are still working on how we can understand better the intersection of the dynamics of discrimination by gender or of stratification by gender with those of stratification by skin tone and stratification by class. So it's still a work in progress into understanding how those interact. And in particular, because the Mexican case or the Latin American case in particular has this high degree of persistence through history to understand what are the mechanisms that guarantee that persistence. So I think those areas, those focuses on how different axes of stratification intersect and interact and reinforce each other, and what are the mechanisms of historical persistence of structures of inequality, are going to be at the top of the research agenda for the next couple of years, because I also think that those two will allow us to better design policies to move societies into a more egalitarian and more equal footing in terms of access to opportunities for all its members.
That's very interesting. So what are some common misconceptions about stratification economics, and in your opinion, how would you address them?
So I think that there are several common misconceptions. I think that one of the most common and one that I face commonly among my students is that, oh, so we are just going to study the role of race in the economy, right? And we're going to only study that. Whereas, no, the notion of stratification economics is to understand the different social identities and how they are constructed that are hierarchically ordered in a society. So that means that for one society like the US, that is race, but for others, it's not race, but it's skin tone, like in Latin American societies, or it's intersection of both, or it's ethnic origin, or it's gender, or it's so on and so forth. So it's not only that we're only focusing on one specific axis of stratification, but in actually understanding what is an axis of stratification, and with that analytical toolkit, approaching the study of different societies. Another common misconception is that, well, in order to consider stratification economics, I just need to include a dummy variable in my regression so that I am able to differentiate the slopes over the intercepts. And that's it. That's stratification economics. Well, no. The idea is that you need to understand what are the relevant axes of the stratification and why they are relevant. So to understand, like, well, we have this particular society, let's say the Mexican case, with a colonial past, but also you have a social revolution in the beginning of the 20th century. So we need to understand why a skin tone is still relevant even after this type of historical process. Just including the dummy variable is not going to help you to explain that. So it's more than just including the dummy variable. It's understanding everything that might be captured by that dummy variable. And a third one, I will say that, oh, well, stratification economics necessarily is like militant in terms of its conclusions. So you have the conclusions and then you have to justify it. And I think that's not true. I think that stratification economics has a clear policy bent, and that's true. But those policies are informed by the research. It's not that the proposals made, for example, in the United States case for baby bonds or all the discussion of how to close the racial wealth gap are arising from out of the thin air of the people who are thinking of them. But if you look at their trajectories, they have done a lot of research before arriving to the proposals. And I think that sometimes because the proposals are more flashy in terms of the public discussion than the research, that tends to be overlooked. Mm-hmm. And I think that is a common misconception in terms of, oh, well, you do that because you want specific policies to be enacted. Whereas it's the contrary. I want those specific policies to be enacted because I have dedicated this amount of time to researching. And I found out that given what we know about the stratification system in the US, those policies are the ones that can address this problem. So that I would say those are like the three biggest ones and the ones that arise more frequently in conversations with people that are not on the field.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, it's been fascinating talking to you today. But for those who want to learn more, which I'm guessing a lot of people will, where can listeners find you, follow your research, and just learn more about you?
So I regret to say that I am an avid Twitter user or X user. And you can find me there at MGF91. And most of my research is available through my webpage, which is Monroy-Gómez-Franco.com, or at the webpage of the UMass Amherst Econ Department.
And we'll put a link to all those in our show notes at the end of or wherever they find the show notes. So I know this is a loaded question, so like prepare yourself. But I do like to end our discussion with looking forward. So what do you envision the future of social economics looks like? I'm
actually optimistic about that. And the reason I've become more optimistic since starting teaching here at UMass is because there is a lot of enthusiasm among undergrads and among grad students about learning um, about the different areas that social economics tend to focus on. Like, how can we understand better distributional processes? How can we think of the macroeconomy as benefiting the lives of the people in more precarious positions? So I have, I mean, as I said, I started studying during the 2008 crisis, and my main motivation was I want to understand what the hell is happening. Coming particularly from a developing country, that was like, okay, but this is the type of crisis that we see here, why it's happening in the US. And now what I see is that what among the students, at least what they tell me is that, well, yes, I want to understand what determines the inequality that I see with my own eyes. What are the reasons and what we can do to change so that there are no more homeless people and so on. So I think that motivation, that drive to change the world and to do it in an informed way speaks of the relevance of social economy right now, and particularly in terms of not only its relevance for furthering the academic study, but of using that as a framework to inform policy. I'm very optimistic about that.
Well, thank you so much, Luis, for being with us today. It was a fascinating discussion. And again, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Iris, for the very nice conversation.